Deepfakes, particularly malicious ones, pose a serious threat to our democratic processes, particularly during elections. While exciting, technological advances in the field of generative AI bring new challenges in maintaining the integrity of our political and electoral system. The proliferation of highly realistic yet fabricated content, particularly in the digital realm, poses a risk to our electoral system, and if we are not careful, will shake the trust citizens have in the democratic process here in Singapore. It bears reiterating that deepfakes and digitally altered content are a very real and present danger to democracy. As mentioned by the Minister and also Member Yip earlier, in the 2023 Slovak parliamentary elections, we witnessed the potential impact on elections of the malicious use of deepfakes to sway the results of an election. Just 2 days before the elections there, during the equivalent of our cooling-off day, a fake audio clip surfaced, which was said to have been a recording of pro-European candidate Michal Šimečka discussing electoral fraud with a prominent journalist. Both quickly denied its authenticity, but the clip went viral. The impact was also amplified by the deepfake being released during the election's silence period, where media is prohibited from discussing election-related developments. In that election, the pro-Russia candidate Robert Fico ultimately won, which naturally led to speculation about whether the deepfake contributed towards Šimečka's loss, given that he was polling stronger than the ultimate victor. While political scientists on the whole concluded that the deepfake alone did not cause Šimečka to lose, the very speculation caused by its going viral laid bare how dangerous it is for a democracy to exist in an environment of low trust in public institutions and a population with a propensity to believe in conspiracy theories. WP therefore supports the introduction of legislation to combat the threat of digitally manipulated media contained in this amendment bill, although I wish to raise two main areas of concern and seek further clarifications from the Minister on other further technical points. First, the new Section 42L, subsection 4, contains a number of carve-outs from the ban on manipulated content during the election period for online election advertising, including for authorised news agencies. The reason given for this is to allow factual reporting. However, this is not enough reason to exempt these actors, as factual reporting should not require reproduction of prohibited material. In fact, we should consider a concerning scenario. Authorised news agencies, when reported on prohibited content, might inadvertently spread misinformation. In our attention deficit world, many readers skim headlines and images without carefully reading the full article or captions. This creates a risk where such content, even when presented as part of factual reporting, could be mistaken for genuine content and go viral as real news. Thus, the very act of reporting by reproducing these prohibited materials might unintentionally amplify their reach and impact. Our disquiet over creating such a two-tier media landscape leads to questions about how we can ensure that media entities exempt from the prohibitions of the Act do not publish such content without consequences. What mechanisms will be in place to hold these outlets accountable if they do publish or propagate prohibited content, intentionally or unintentionally? More specifically, does the Minister believe that the existing codes of practice governing authorised news agencies are sufficient to address the concerns raised above, or would further updates be needed to combat the unique risks associated with digitally manipulated content and deepfakes? Would there thus also be new codes or updates to the existing codes of practice, such as the promised new code of conduct which MDDI states will be published to ensure social media companies do more to moderate content? And when is the expected publication date? Second, the bill also states that private or domestic communications are exempted. The new Section 61MA subsection 4 exempts private or domestic electronic communications between two or more individuals from the regulations. While we acknowledge the intent to protect personal privacy, we hope that this exemption does not become a Trojan horse used to overcome the bill's defences combating disinformation. This is because disinformation often spreads rapidly through private channels. It is also not a secret that modern communication platforms have blurred the lines between private and public spaces. What would be the standing of spaces such as private Facebook groups, private Telegram channels, locked Facebook profiles, or messaging group chats? Would whether a channel is private hinge on whether having people in the group not knowing each other, for example? It is important to have clarity on this, as academics have found that there is emerging evidence that propagandists increasingly exploit applications such as WhatsApp and Telegram, preying on their popularity, loose moderation policies, and trust within private networks. In Slovakia, the example I raised earlier, Telegram has become a haven for pro-Russian propaganda, and the deepfake of Shumechka was spread wildly on pro-Fico Telegram channels ahead of the election. In view of this, can the minister clarify how the exemption for private messages will address the risks associated with widespread disinformation spreading through these channels? What are the criteria to be used to determine whether or not a specific communication is private and therefore exempt from the prohibitions contained in the bill? Aside from these, I have some clarifications around three broad areas. First, the scoping of the prohibitions. Second, questions about the reporting and the investigation of the alleged offences. And third, the potential misuse of the regime. On the scoping of the prohibitions, I note that the prohibitions and offences only apply during election periods, and it is confined to Singapore. While it is necessarily the way it is scoped because the acts being amended are acts governing our two types of elections in Singapore, what is the treatment regulating prohibited content aimed at influencing political sentiment when we are not in an official election period? Deceptive information may begin swaying public opinion well before an election is formally announced, and this is especially the case as the potential window for calling a general election narrows over time. After all, foreign disinformation groups are known to wage persistent year-round disinformation campaigns to influence political outcomes. For example, the government of Canada detected a Chinese spamouflage campaign where various Canadian MPs, including its Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, and members of the Cabinet, were targeted. The rapid response mechanism alerted the affected MPs, who were provided with advice and support on how to protect themselves from the campaign. The aim, to discredit and denigrate targeted MPs by questioning the political and ethical standards, using deepfake videos and fake social media profiles. While the punishment outlined in this bill are meant to act as strong deterrents, they do not fully address threats from those operating outside of Singapore's jurisdiction. How then will we effectively combat the risks associated with a foreign coordinated campaign using prohibited content like deepfakes? Next, moving to an investigation of alleged offences. Given that members of the public can report alleged prohibited content, where and what is investigative capacity to investigate claims made in this regard? Who undertakes the investigation, and how long would it take for these to be completed before any further action is taken? What resources, both in terms of manpower and otherwise, would be available to the RO and the ELD to make relevant decisions and take enforcement action? After all, in Singapore, we are somewhat unique in having a very short campaign period, and added together with the quick spread of digital information, it makes it even more imperative that decisions about claims have to be made rapidly. Also, what happens after an offence is reported and the decision is made to issue a corrective order? Would the RO then simultaneously ask both the poster and platform to take it down? What then happens if there is a refusal to comply with the order? After all, for platforms, the maximum fine of $1 million there might be question about whether it was sufficient to compel trillion-dollar companies such as Meta and TikTok to comply. Would the minister also be able to elaborate on any appeals process if one were to disagree with the corrective order? This is particularly important, too, as information has now gotten to the stage where experts sometimes even disagree about whether a piece of content is real or doctored. Finally, moving to abuse of this process, particularly given the very short nature of our official elections period and given that members of the public can also make reports. While we often view deepfakes as malignant and harmful, recent elections, such as the recently concluded Indian national elections, have seen instances where generative AI and deepfake technology has been used to manipulate videos of candidates in a way to benefit them. A classic example would be using deepfake technology to show candidates speaking in languages or dialects that they themselves do not speak in a misleading effort to endear themselves to certain segments of the electorate. Would these cases of positive deepfakes fall under the scope of the prohibition? Also, given that anyone can make a report, what is the penalty if a member of the public makes a false report? And how will this be communicated so that members of the public don't spam reports as an act of mischief during the election campaign? Finally, while we have focused a lot today about the potential harms and dangers that deepfakes may pose to democratic processes, some researchers have also warned against being overly alarmist. In a 2020 paper, Orban warns against what he terms as technology panics, arguing that these can sometimes encourage quick fixes that centralise control over truth. I believe that the member Yip also raised similar concerns about overreach earlier. Instead, I think it would be more helpful to invest in nuanced and effective proactive public education strategies. A technique that appears promising is pre-bunking, the process of debunking lies, tactics, or sources before they strike, because prevention is more impactful than cure. It works like inoculation and aims to build mental resilience against misinformation before being exposed to its full force. Much like MINDEF's Exercise SG Ready earlier this year involving a simulated phishing exercise run by organizations, pre-bunking works by exposing people to weakened forms of misinformation and uses this to teach them to spot manipulative techniques used by fake news peddlers. This approach seems to work across different cultures and across those with differing political views and should be integrated into our wider strategy tackling the effects of misinformation on our population. Specific proposals could include enhancing media literacy education in schools and other touchpoints, where our citizens hone their critical thinking skills necessary to navigate the increasingly complex information landscape. We can also use short-form content on social media and interactive online experiences to reach a wide audience, teaching them to recognize common manipulation techniques used in deepfakes and other types of misinformation campaigns. To conclude, we support the addition of measures to tackle the harm that deepfakes and such manipulated content can cause during the especially vulnerable period of an election campaign. However, I believe that there are a number of concerns and clarifications that I hope the Minister can address as we work together to ensure that our democratic process does not come under threat by sophisticated, manipulated media.
Members have also asked for the rationale behind the proposed duration of the ban. Previously, Ms. Ting Ru asked about the recourse for political candidates affected by deepfakes during cooling off or polling day in elections. The Eleanor Bill provides the recourse, but we know that purveyors of deepfakes will not constrain themselves to just the cooling off day or polling day. If we are to effectively uphold the integrity of elections, the protections under the bill must be available when election activities are the most intense and mischief makers most active. This is usually the election period, which is also defined in Section 61S of the Parliamentary Elections Act and Section 42R of the Presidential Elections Act. It starts from the issuance of the writ of election and ends after the close of polling. Mr. Yip Hon Wing and Ms. He suggested that the proposed duration of the ban should be longer. I thank them for their suggestion and agree with both their concerns. Practically speaking, however, even if we wanted Eleanor to take effect X days before an election, we cannot do so until the writ is issued and polling day revealed. This is why we will introduce a code of practice to require specified social media services to implement safeguards beyond the election period specified in the bill. This allows for calibration of the speed of response and the resource requirements outside of election periods. Ms. He opposed the proposal to allow mainstream media platforms to reproduce content prohibited under the Eleanor Bill when reporting on news and current affairs during the election period. I'm slightly puzzled because in her speech, Ms. He also advocated educating the public through short-form videos, which will likely have to reproduce such content in some form to show how realistic they are. Our belief is that news agencies can and should play a part in preserving the integrity of our elections. The prohibition does not apply to news published by authorised news agencies because of their duty to report on news fairly and accurately to inform and educate the public. In fact, this is not new. Today, media outlets report on online scams to educate the public about its dangers and to let citizens know how to identify and avoid scams. This often includes republishing images of online content to alert citizens to the scam. Members including Mr. Zulkarnain and Ms. He have also asked, what recourse is there if a piece of content was deemed to be wrongfully taken down? Recipients of a corrective direction who feel that their content has been wrongfully taken down can contact the RO to provide supporting evidence of their claims. If the RO does not accept their appeal, they may apply to the courts for judicial review of the RO's decision. If content was found to have been mistakenly taken down due to a false declaration by a candidate, there will be serious consequences for the candidate, including the loss of his or her seat if elected. If the content does not otherwise meet the criteria of prohibition, it can be reposted. To Ms. He's query, there are also current penalties in place for persons other than candidates who knowingly provide false information to government agencies. During this debate and on previous occasions, members including Ms. Sylvia Lim and Ms. He have acknowledged the difficulties in determining the authenticity of online media content. This is why candidates will have to make a declaration in addition to their request to RO to assess content under the Eleanor Bill. Members, including Ms. Yip and Ms. So, have asked about the timely issuance of corrective directions and safeguards against foreign-based entities who attempt to influence our elections. We recognize the need to quickly disable such false online content about candidates, but there is also the need to be rigorous and fair. The RO will have to strike a balance. Once a corrective direction is issued, the expectation is for individuals, social media services, and internet access service providers to respond within hours. This is to minimize the potential harm that such content could cause during our election period. The proposed ban covers the publication in Singapore of all digitally generated and manipulated online election advertising depicting candidates, regardless of the nationality of the user who created or published the content. This addresses the question by Ms. He. In addition, we already have rules prohibiting foreigners or foreign entities from knowingly publishing or publicly displaying any election advertising. This is in line with the principle that Singapore's politics are for Singaporeans alone to decide. If we are aware of hostile information campaigns or foreign interference, we will address them under the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, or FICA. Ms. He asked if the penalties for non-compliance by the social media services are too low to have sufficient impact or deterrence. Dr. Wan Rizal asked if the penalties should be scaled according to the platform's reach and impact. So the financial penalty quantum is comparable with other local legislation that covers social media services, such as the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act and the Broadcasting Act. Non-compliance with the corrective directions is an offence punishable by a fine of up to 1 million Singapore dollars, and it will be for the courts to decide the appropriate level for each offence. Beyond the exact quantum involved, the imposition of financial penalties on the services for not doing enough to preserve free and fair elections would have reputational implications for their respective platforms, whether from the perspective of Singapore users or globally. Some members, like Dr. Wan Rizal and Ms. He, have also asked if the RO or election officials can proactively monitor the internet to identify prohibited content and how they will be supported in enforcing provisions under the bill. During the election, there are processes in place to monitor for and minimize the risk of election interference that can arise from the spread of prohibited online election advertising. There will be dedicated teams stood up during the election period for this purpose, and they will work closely with the social media services to act swiftly on prohibited content. As candidates will be best placed to determine if there is false online election advertising being circulated, we will rely primarily on their requests to review problematic content. However, the RO may still assess and act on problematic content without a candidate's request and declaration if the content is surfaced and deemed likely to threaten electoral integrity. Ms. Yip, Ms. He, and Ms. So have asked about our public education efforts to alert our citizens to the dangers of AI-generated misinformation. We agree that a digitally aware public is the strongest defense we have against misleading and deceptive manipulated online content. Public education plays a critical role in empowering Singaporeans to safeguard themselves against risks in the digital space and be resilient to such threats. To this end, the government has put in place public education programs to equip the public to be discerning producers and consumers of information and protect themselves against online falsehoods. For example, the National Library's SURE program, which stands for Source, Understand, Research and Evaluate, has developed resources and organized activities to educate Singaporeans about the dangers of misinformation. In fact, NLB is currently rolling out its community outreach initiative, Be Sure Together, Gen AI and Deepfakes Edition, which provides opportunities for the public to learn about the uses and threats of generative AI.
I just have one clarification on the confusion that the Minister mentioned about my concerns raised about exemption for authorised news agencies and her linking it to one of the suggestions that I made in relation to public education efforts. In fact, I think I mentioned in my speech when I talked about the use of pre-bunking in a sort of inoculative approach, I talked about exposing people to weakened forms of misinformation, so not necessarily real deepfakes. And also, I think when I talked about using short-form content, I was actually referring to generic short-form videos, for example, but not during the election period.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Ms. He for her clarification. I think it's helpful.